Hi people, how are you all? Hope you are doing well. In today's video, I want to talk about something that I have totally, absolutely never talked about before in my entire life. My comic! Oh wait, that's right, I never shut up about the damn thing. That said, today I wanted to talk specifically about progress in my comic, and particularly how much progress I've made in 1 year, because it is approximately 1 year now. That said, I want to clarify that I'm not talking about 1 year since I started uploading the thing. In fact, I've still not started uploading it yet. No, we're talking about 1 year since I first thought, hey, I could totally write a comic about Arthurian legends. That might be cool and totally not time-consuming. Equally, before you start panicking and going, she's barely made any progress at all, that means I'll never write a comic, it simply takes far too long. Remember that I'm only 19, and whilst I did admittedly have a lot of free time last summer to work on it, since September I've mostly been focusing on surviving my first year of uni, and so the poor comic has taken a bit of a backseat and been a little bit neglected. But I am home now and hoping to make some actual headway over the next few months, so let's discuss what has been done. The first and most obvious thing I think I've made progress on is that I have a complete cast of characters. They have designs, they have backstories, they have complicated relationships, they have character arcs, and in fact, if anything, I possibly have too many characters. And whilst that's partly my fault, it's also partly a side problem of the kind of story I chose to write. But more on that later. I currently have 6 sort of main characters, and I say sort of because it's more like 5 main characters that kind of switch in and out of being a focused group of 3, and then the 6th character spends most of her time moving the plot around rather than being a focused character, and she's kind of just there to mess up everybody else's lives, basically. That said, there was initially at least one other main character I wanted to include, plus his brothers are also vaguely relevant to the plot, and I really love his characterization and some of the Arthurian retellings that I've read. And that was just for the main characters. I had side characters and minor relations coming out of my eyeballs with this, and so whilst I suppose my biggest area of progress is the character designs, theoretically the bigger achievement was getting rid of so many characters, because Arthurian legend has a lot of characters. Speaking of characters, I should probably introduce the 2 I'm actually drawing today. They are Brangian and Governell, but I tend to just refer to them as Bran and Gov simply because Arthurian legend has a habit of giving characters ridiculously long names that I never know how to pronounce correctly anyway. And although there is one random knight named Gareth, who I kind of wish I could put in this story just to save myself one extra comment of how do you pronounce this dude's name, you know, they're very confusing. So Bran and Gov. I chose to draw these 2 really for 2 reasons. One, I don't think I've ever drawn Gov on my channel or on my Instagram. I drew him once for a height chart that I did, and that's about it. And it makes him the only one of the 6 main characters, the princess who nobody likes included, who has not made it into a video yet. And the other reason is probably because these 2 are the characters who have changed the most and least since I started. That sentence made sense, don't think about it too hard. Point being, Bran has basically stayed the same since I first created her. There have admittedly been a few outfit alterations and changes to her colour palette over time, but in essentials she's basically the same. A tiny little scrappy thing who will absolutely fight you if only she had ever picked up a sword before in her life and was taller than 5 foot. I may have possibly projected my own frustration of being called short onto her, but you know, we're not going to focus on that. Anyway, she's very spunky, she speaks her mind, and once she gets out from under the impressive grip of the Princess Iseult, I'd like to think she mellows out a bit and stops being quite so angsty. But as I mentioned, she's the character whose general creation and character arc hasn't changed much since last year, so while she's very cute in an angry kitten sort of way, there's not a lot to say about her, and I believe I've actually done an entire video on her already, which you can watch if you wish, although it's a little bit old by now. I know most YouTubers wouldn't consider 5 months old for a video, but given how much progress I've made in the last year on videos, 5 months is kind of old. Gov, on the other hand, has changed tons. In fact, about a year ago he was essentially a non-entity. Sir Tristan is one of the only knights in legend who actually has a squire who has a name, that being Gov. So I figured it would be important to include him just because the poor guy is left out of so many stories, and I felt like he deserved it. You know, on second thoughts, it's not really a surprise I have far too many characters. I just kind of get attached to these guys for no apparent reasons. But initially, I didn't really know what I was going to do with him, and I had no clue how to characterize him. That said, one day, in midsummer of 2020, I was binge watching my way through a series of OSP Trope Talk videos, which amusingly enough is exactly what I was doing yesterday instead of editing this video. Anyways, watching Trope Talk, specifically things like the 5-man band Trope Talk, helped me kind of work out where the holes in my character roster were. Hence, me deciding that Gov could fill the role of kind of like the big guy softie. Unfortunately for me, just deciding that a character is a softie who's great at punching things doesn't compensate for him having an actual personality or real purpose in the plot. Until about 2 weeks ago when I started cutting characters from that endless list I mentioned. I had this one guy I really wanted to add into the story, whose name is Gahiris, which I totally definitely pronounced right and totally know how to pronounce. Partly because lots of Gahiris' relations are actually related to the overarching villains that show up in the second half of the story, but mostly just because of the way he plays off my main character Dinadan. Like I said, there wasn't really space for a version of him in the story, or any easy reason why he'd be travelling with my set of characters. And that's where Gov came in, as here we had a non-entity who could fill that exact role. Someone who would likely share Dinadan's worldview and slight cynicism towards some of the dumber rules of chivalry, but would also have an immediately much better relationship with Tristan than a Gahiris variant who would probably dislike him. It would also make sense for him to be exceptionally practical, as he's not a knight and isn't kept to the same rules as them, but could also be a highly competent fighter because he's a squire by choice, not because no one will knight him. Where Gahiris would have probably been expected to at least follow some of the rules and would have run into the danger of becoming very similar to Dinadan, which he is in some stories I've read, Gov didn't really suffer from this problem because he's a different category of person in this world by serving a knight instead of being one himself. Now, not all of Gahiris' traits quite fit here, which is where I decided to go outside my little universe for some inspiration. And by that I mean Torchwood. A couple of months ago, I got very obsessed with the Doctor Who spin-off, and by extension, the character of Yanto Jones. It's no secret that I often take bits of other people's characters to help make up the personalities of my own, and I'll be honest, I did lean on Yanto a little bit here to help me write in Gov. Both characters are incredibly loyal to the man they work for, both are quiet and often underestimated and not seen as equal to their peers initially, and both are significantly smarter and more competent than they seem. Tristan also has a similar action hero status to Jack from Torchwood, so it also helps me work out that sort of dynamic and how they'd interact with each other. That said, there are obviously a number of differences, because I'm not just going to copy and paste other people's characters, because that's kinda mean. For starters, in my story, Tristan and Gov have known each other since they were kids and implicitly trust and respect each other from the get-go. The story follows the breaking down of that trust and respect rather than the building of that trust and respect over time. Also, Gov doesn't actually suffer from the same confidence issues as Yanto, although sometimes he's frustrated by some of the other knights ignore him. He knows what his own skill set is, and he knows his value to Tristan, and he doesn't ever feel the need to doubt that. And instead, he possibly suffers a character flaw of being kind of too confident in that relationship, or at least too slow to notice when it starts to deteriorate into a downslide into madness. Also, as a side note, for anyone who does know Torchwood, as much as I love Yanto as a ship, the big difference here is that in no way are Tristan and Gov romantically interested in each other at all. They've both got other things going on, and I just don't see that working, possibly because there are slight differences to the characters in my head compared to Jack and Yanto. Like I said, I'm not copying and pasting. There's things I have that I can't quite put into words as to how they interact with each other that just would not make sense for that. Also, you know, if you've read any story on Tristan and Iseult, you'll know that Tristan gets hit with a love potion, like, very early on, and it would just be mean to build up a loving, trusting relationship and then smash it. Gov's outfit was also redesigned back in January-ish, I want to say, but honestly didn't go through too many iterations. Initially I had in mind something similar to how Percival from BBC's Merlin dresses, because they both kind of have the big guy status and stuff, and I imagine we're both with really big swords. But then I remember that this comic is set in England, and there ain't no way any characters walking around in sleeveless tank tops in our sort of weather. So instead he got a yellow tunic, because I hadn't used the colour yellow on any characters yet, with the sleeves rolled up both because I can't draw elbows and, you know, forearms. Also, I decided to give him some funky leather armor and straps and things because A, I really like that, and B, because while he isn't a knight and so isn't likely to get into many proper duels, he is kind of like the tank character, and so he kind of needs some sort of armor, otherwise he's just going to look unprepared. So after that terribly long detour into one of my new favourite characters, what work have I actually done on the story so far? To be perfectly honest, this is kind of a loaded question since, as of when I'm recording this, I believe I only have 2 panels completed of this entire story. Now, that might sound like barely anything, but there is a reason for it. You see, the number 1 piece of advice that people tend to give you for starting your first comic is to do something small, so you aren't super invested in something that might take years to complete but is going to be really dodgy at the beginning because you have no skills. That's part of the reason I chose Arthurian Legends as a base story. When I first chose this idea, I'd previously been working on a different, completely original comic idea instead, that was not only going to likely take me forever to finish, but I was having a lot of trouble fleshing out the middle parts of that story, because, you know, I don't have story writing skills. The legends are structured in arcs, often focusing on unrelated quests and adventures, and so I figured it would make a nice easy way to have my story be very episodic, with a couple of chapters per arc, and the ability to kind of call it quits whenever I wanted to. It would also give me plenty of stuff to happen in the middle of my story, and some kind of rough plot to work with while I get used to writing these. You know, there's already a set quest of the time Dinadan and Tristan were forced to fight 30 knights because someone had threatened their friend. You know, things that just give me an idea of what I'm working around, and so that I can just shove that full of character work, which is what I'm probably better at. Unfortunately, my story planning ability works much faster than my story creating ability, and I quickly accidentally had a ton of long-term subplots and overarching themes I wanted to include, and the original episodic structure kind of just dissolved under these brilliant grand ideas I had. So that means I've actually restarted this comic a number of times, something I believe the internet also advises against because you'll never get anywhere if you keep restarting it, but oh well. As a matter of fact, I have 3 different first panels for this story, and I'm currently on the 3rd rewrite of the script. Although it could be more than that, that's just, I'm calling it Mark 3, but, you know, I'm on the 3rd attempt at drawing the panels, and I'm calling that Mark 2, so there may be a script I've lost somewhere here. So, whilst physically, I've not produced much work in the past year, I've not produced many chapters or panels even, conceptually a lot has changed, and to be fair, at one point I did have a chapter and a half completely drawn out with text on and properly finished and sliced into little bits, but it was messy and it tried to introduce about 7 characters in one chapter, although I'm not actually sure Gov was even in the story back then, so it was potentially about to get even worse. Not to mention I'd invented some random antagonist just for the hell of it that isn't got any precedent in any of the legends anywhere. That said, I'm currently much happier with the state of my story. It may have taken me about a year to get here, but hopefully this will be the one. And maybe by the end of the summer I might get around to actually uploading some of it, because of course by the time I've got that first chapter actually out and uploaded, it's sort of difficult for me to go back and restart. At least in my head I'm telling me I can't restart once I've posted, because otherwise I totally would. If I had to give any advice to you guys about how to start a comic, although as you can tell my own journey's been a bit chaotic and I'm by no means an expert, the main thing would be absolutely listen to all the other YouTubers out there who will tell you to just get started regardless of how good you are. Personally, I get overly invested in long-term character developments and so was never likely to end up writing anything short. But I would say to think carefully about how you structure your first few chapters and essentially work out how you can make them as exciting as possible while introducing the bare minimum number of characters you need. Personally, I found that there was only so much you could fit in the 30 or so panels that can make up a decent-sized chapter. And I say decent-sized as someone who's not used to drawing comics and so thought more than that would be a bit too much to take on. Having fewer characters to establish will just make it a million times easier. Equally, think through how you can get more information across in more concise ways. In version 2 of my first intro, I opened with Dinadan receiving his first quest at the Round Table, and that meant drawing 10 different knights trying to juggle characters like Arthur or Kai, who really weren't likely to become relevant until at least halfway through the story, and then I had to have him go talk to Tristan to try and convince him to come on the mission as well at the end of it. Alternatively, my current version opens with Dinadan asking for Tristan's help, allowing him to simply summarise what would have happened in that meeting, rather than me writing dialogue for that entire argument where they try to convince Dinadan he totally needs to escort this princess that he doesn't like. Now my first chapter is neatly confined to basically one conversation between Tristan, Dinadan and Gov, establishing that dynamic instead of trying to keep track of all these different and mostly irrelevant characters that I really didn't need. I think that is probably all I have to say about this, although I may have missed something because I got quite rambly at the end there and I wrote this script in one go and recorded it all in one go and it's going to take me 7 hours to edit. That said, I do apologise for spending more than about half of the time on this just gushing about Gov instead of actually talking about progress and my methods and such. Either way, I do hope you enjoy this video. If you did, please leave a like and a comment, I would really appreciate it. It always makes my day. If you have advice on how I can better script write for the voiceovers for these so it doesn't turn into this mess, that would also be exceptionally helpful. Particularly though, if there is anything you want to see me draw over the next few weeks, feel free to leave some suggestions. I've been having kind of intermittent art block, and so anyone who has something you want me to draw, particular ship or characters from fandoms, feel free to suggest that. Anywho, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye.